Step out of the boat into a world of courage and grace this week. The message dives deep into Peter's audacious walk on water, exploring the harmony of faith, trust, and divine presence amid life's storms. Discover how even when sinking in doubt, grace lifts us higher, guiding us to navigate challenges with unwavering resolve. Join us as we unravel the lessons from Peter's journey, offering comfort and inspiration for our own walks in faith. Here's an interesting and unique story in the gospel today. It's unique because Matthew is the only gospel that recounts Peter's attempt and brief success at walking on the water. Matthew, Mark, and Luke sort of go together textually. This is a little brain candy that you can share around the water cooler or by the grill while waiting for the burgers to get done. Mark seems to be a primary source because you can line the three Gospels up side by side and see them move through the same stories as Mark, oftentimes word for word. Sometimes there will be a story that is only in Matthew and Luke, and scholars attribute that to be a source that we don't have. We call the unknown source Q, which is short for quella, which means source in Latin. Then we have some material that only appears in Matthew or Luke, and we call those sources M or L, respectively. The three are called the Synoptic Gospels because they look very much the same. I have a book that has all three Gospels lined up side by side in parallel where you can easily see this phenomenon. Or now you can easily search for Gospel parallels on your phone. John, though, does his own thing. You may not have noticed but our readings for church, called the lectionary, spread out over 3 years in a rotation, years A, B, and C, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke years. John is spread throughout all 3 years. Here's the interesting thing. While Peter only walks in Matthew, Jesus walks on water in Matthew and Mark, but not in Luke, which is kind of interesting. By the way, Jesus also walks on water in John. I wish I had a cool Schoolhouse Rock song and cartoon for that information. So as I set sail into the interesting passage this week, I got struck and stuck on my own question. As it turns out, I couldn't find one single pastor or scholar that addressed my question. I couldn't let it go, but it bore personal fruit for me through the search and helped me to a deeper understanding of a lot of things. But first, let's set the scene. The disciples are caught in rough seas and high winds, and they can't make headway. Jesus finally got some time alone that he had been trying for. It looks like he stayed up all night and heads out across the wind and waves between about 3 and 6 a.m. A lot of important stuff happens in the Bible around that time. Well, Jacob wrestled with God and met God face to face at that time. Moses led the Israelites across the Red Sea at that time. I had never realized that happened at night. Gideon defeated the Midianites at that time. The angels appeared to the shepherds around that time, and Jesus was resurrected from the dead around that time. Along with the importance of the time is the description of Jesus's walking across the sea and Jesus's response to the disciples thinking he's a ghost. In the book of Job, which is all about suffering, faith, and the human experience in the face of adversity, much like these disciples through the wind and the wave, Job speaks of God treading on the waves of the sea, which can be seen as a parallel to the image of Jesus walking on the water. It also recalls God moving across the waters of creation, or at creation. Water and the deep were the deep and pre-creation chaos, and they weren't understood and explored in this time period. People that worked on the sea, like fishermen, were a little suspect and sketchy according to others. Here Jesus, like God in creation, exercises authority over the waters and the chaos. In the story of Peter walking on the water, the phrase "I am" is associated with Jesus' declaration, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." The phrase "it is I" is translated into Greek as "I am." This connection echoes the name for God given to Moses in the Hebrew Bible, where God identifies himself as "I am who I am." The phrase signifies divine presence and authority there on the seas. So that's information that I knew or that I found in my study this week. That's helpful for me in understanding the setting and then being in a bad, chaotic, terrifying situation. It helps me to understand the Mark and I guess the John part of Jesus walking on the water. But my questions came when Matthew introduced Peter. Here's what my problem was. They think that they're dealing with a ghost. Jesus, and they don't know it's Jesus, says, as we discovered, "Have courage, I am, don't fear." Okay, makes sense so far. Then enter Peter. "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you." Okay, that's the best test he can come up with, is where my mind immediately went. Last I heard, they thought it was a ghost. Did they think all ghosts couldn't lie? Usually we hear about ghosts and they're malevolent and do bad things. I'm in the boat and I say, "What's your mother's maiden name? What was the name of your first pet? In what city were you born?" to check things out. Not, "Have me get out of a boat into a raging sea." So I had to explore what was going on here. Why did he go there? I realized that I was outside of Peter's personal story. I didn't hear Jesus say it. I didn't see what he saw and feel what he felt. Now remember, Peter did have a tendency to be caught up in the moment and to overstate the magnitude, maybe of his devotion, or maybe it's an overestimation of his ability when caught up in the moment. Either way, he's trying so hard to be what Jesus wants him to be. I feel like I can really see that and feel that because I'm sure many of us have done that before. He wants to be that faithful servant and show Jesus that he can be. But he is there and hears Jesus. Was it the way Jesus said it? Was it the phrasing? Was it that he had witnessed Jesus calm the storm? I don't know, and I can't know. But I do know that there are people in my life that I recognize by knowing them so well. I knew my mom by the sound of her footsteps. You would have had to spend time with her and know her deeply to recognize her that way. Who am I then to say what Peter should have said? Peter knew Jesus well enough, though, to step out of that boat. He recognized, he discerned because of that relationship. The first lesson with Elijah is also about that discernment of God's presence. Elijah, too, is having a terrible life or death day. He's hiding in a cave 100 miles away, waiting for Jezebel's army to catch up with him and kill him. Earthquake, wind, and fire pass by. Incredible, huge events that one might attribute to God, but Elijah knows and recognizes and discerns God in that still small voice, in that quietness. Spending time with God, spending time with Jesus is key to knowing, recognizing, and discerning. Check out Jesus at the beginning of the reading. We may have read it as sort of an intro to the main part, to the main event of water walking, but Jesus is exhibiting the key. He takes time to spend time in the relationship with God, in dialogue, in discussion, in prayer with God. He'd been trying to get to that all day, so he ended up staying up to do it. Ends up having to walk to work, as it is, in a storm to make it on time. But Jesus is a hard example to live up to perfectly. And here we have Peter. Let's give it to him, though. He got out of the boat. He was walking on water. Jesus called to him and he came. He wanted the challenge and he got it and was making way. But he wasn't Jesus. None of us are. We are called and we may get it going. But there are times fear creeps in. So what then? We see it in the story. But hold up. Will Starkweather is the pastor of St. Martin Lutheran Church in Sugar Land, Texas. I found him online and called him a few years ago to talk to him. I did that because he changed my life, and I got to tell him that, and how what he said at a national youth gathering affected me, and I asked permission to share his story. You see, Will got to speak to 30,000 youth at the 2018 ELCA Youth Gathering. I got to see him speak on YouTube, and it helped me to see grace so much more vividly in my life and in my journey. I also read an article where Will stated in an article that, I remember the first time I saw myself in the scriptures. Jesus encountered a man who lived among the tombs and was always howling and bruising himself with stones. He addressed the youth. I was a freshman in high school when I started cutting. On the surface, I looked like I had it all together, he said. However, Will suffered from anxiety and depression, and as he said, there was a pain in my heart and in my head and that I did not know how to heal. For him, cutting was a place where he found control. Whenever he felt threatened, he turned to self-harm. When he became a college sophomore, he sought help for the first time and shared his hurt and shame that he had been carrying. Will was a very religious person, so he went to his pastor. Will said he shared these things, and then with 4 words, he said, he broke me. He said, you're going to hell. Will left the church and college and sank deeper into depression and self-harm. 2 years later, he was trying to get his life back together, and amazingly, he found another church. But you can only imagine the fear he felt. What a barrier. He finally found the courage to try again. He talked with the pastor and was met again by 4 words. She told him, there's grace for that. He's a pastor now because, as he said, because we experience grace, we can share it. That's Jesus when Peter was caught in the waves and failed and sank. Jesus didn't hesitate to grab him. Sinking, there's grace for that. Failing, there's grace for that. Being afraid to step out of the boat, there's grace for that. Self-harm, there's grace for that. Addiction, there's grace for that. Depression and anxiety, there's grace for that. That hurting thing in your life that makes you feel that no one could ever understand or forgive, there's grace for that. Any shame you carry, there's grace for that. Jesus dragging you back or carrying you, or however he got the waterlogged Peter back to the boat, it was grace all the way. None of us are Jesus. None of us are perfect. We all fall short of the glory of God. I have never even come close to walking on water. We've all experienced fear and sinking and falling short, and there's grace for that. So let's share that grace so that others may experience it and glorify our Father in heaven. Amen.